Hey, welcome back. Part 3 of the Waponi-Woo effects tutorials by Tom Auger. Have you figured out where Waponi-Woo's from yet, you young'uns? Ya little whippersnappers! Here's a hint. Think Tom Hanks and big moons. Alright, that's neither here nor there. Let's get on with things. In the last couple tutorials, we took an overview of the effects stack for the progress bar container. And just sort of showed you how I was repurposing each one of those effects to do something other than what they were intended to do. Not to be clever or perverse, but because that was the only way to kind of achieve the creative vision that I had wanted to get, inspired by a reference image that kind of showed me how glass would look filled with an orange liquid. And so I was trying my best to try to stay faithful to that to a degree. And imagine what that container might look like that would hold it. So on top of having the glassy effect, which I really wanted to make sure was there whether or not the liquid was in there, I did not want to have to devote a separate layer to creating the glass over top. I really just wanted, if I need for whatever reason to resize this element, whether it's for a wireframe, needs it to be longer or taller or fatter or whatever the case may be, I don't want to have to try to sync up two different layers to make it work. I want to make sure that everything that's contained, everything that needs to be done to make this effect work is contained within a single layer. The second layer, of course, is the mercury layer, the orange crush layer, that's then goes inside that. And you can see that even without any of its effects on, it's still rather effective to show filling up with liquid that's somewhat transparent. And the only effect that's really being applied at this point to that layer is just an 80% opacity. We'll turn that off for now. We're going to get into the nitty-gritty of each of these layer effects one at a time and try to best understand that. Before I do that, I'm going to just create a new document and walk you through a very simple little case study on the drop shadow layer effect. Just try to help disambiguate the name of the effect from what it actually is capable of doing. To go there, we're going to have to go back in time. Okay, that was me doing a reverse back in time. Now, imagine the user interface is not this brooding dark, but the standard gray that we're used to seeing. And the day is now January 1st, 1994. So let's just look at what it would take to create a drop shadow before we had layer effects. But we still had layers, just no layer effects. So the brand new layer, lasso tool, drawing our esoteric shape. There we go. Option delete, filling it with a color, Control D, deselect. Alright, how am I going to create a drop shadow from this layer? Simple. Let's just talk about what a drop shadow is. A drop shadow is another layer that's filled with a very dark color, usually black, that's fuzzy, blurry, that sits underneath the layer that's dropping the shadow and is usually offset by a certain amount. The important thing is it usually starts off in the shape of the original layer. So let's get going. How can we do that? Well, we'll duplicate the layer with Command J. Now I want to make this one black, so I'm going to lock the pixels, set my colors to black and white, and fill it with black. This is happening real time, people, just using keyboard shortcuts. If you don't know them, learn them. Alright, there's my layer. It's now sitting currently above the previous layer. Let's unlock those pixels and let's move it. Let's just drag and drop it. So now the black layer is sitting underneath the red layer. We offset that using the move tool. And then we'll apply filter, blur, Gaussian blur. And that represents the amount of the drop shadow. Everything that I'm doing here, of course, can be done nowadays using the layer effects, but could be done as early as 1994 using just exactly the technique that I've showed you here, and could have been done even earlier before layers were invented using alpha channels, but we're not going to go there because that's really ancient history. And then finally, to make this look a little more modest, we'll drop back the opacity, and there's your drop shadow. So that's how a drop shadow works. That's what it does. So the essential components, let's review it, is taking the mask or the shape of the original layer, filling it with a solid color, which we can then optionally adjust the opacity, blurring it, and offsetting it. And that's exactly what the drop shadow layer effect does. So let's just get rid of this guy. Go back up here, effects, drop shadow, which has been now moved for the first time to the very bottom of the stack, which makes a ton of sense. Try to move this out of the way so we can still see what's going on. Okay, there it is. My default settings are pretty modest, so you're not going to see too much. Let's just increase the distance and increase the opacity so we get something similar to what we had before. So, what's a drop shadow? It is a duplicate of the layer that has the same shape. So this filter does that, or this effects does that for us automatically. It's filled with a solid color. There's the solid color there. Look, I got a solid color picker. I can change that to a blue drop shadow if I wanted to. With a blend mode, has an opacity control that we can then play with, and then is blurred. That's done using the size, the blur, and can be offset by a certain distance. So that's exactly what we did before. The difference here is that it's now nicely parameterized. Doesn't take any real thought to create how to create the effect. We can focus more of our attention on what we want the effect to look like. More importantly, this can be recorded in an action. It can be saved in a new style and applied to any other elements as well. So let's now see what we can do with the drop shadow filter to make it look less like a drop shadow. Well, one of the biggest problems with the drop shadow filter is that we tend to think of it as being a shadow. It doesn't have to be a shadow. If we've got a dark background, for example, the drop shadow could be used to lighten the background. It's not going to do anything when I change the color to white here until I also adjust the blend mode. Probably the biggest reason people don't push the drop shadow filter any further is because they don't realize they can mess with the blend mode. Multiply always darkens the background image and ignores white. In this case, our shadow is white, so we're going to use screen, which is the opposite of multiply. Always brightens the underlying image and ignores black. So there's no black here, so we're fine. So look at that. We now have a drop highlight, if you will. And this could be even technically used in some ways to create almost like a 3D effect. A very cheap, poor man's 3D. Look at that. Almost have like a three-dimensional effect there just by tweaking a couple of the parameters. The other parameter that I tweaked was a really great one called the spread. Spread amount pushes out. It basically takes the gradient or the blur of the edges of your shadow and pushes them out. And if you have a spread of 100%, you get no blur whatsoever. And the size is then just used to control the increase in size of the shape. To understand that principle, I'm going to set the distance to 0. And now you can see that all around the shape I have a stroke. So there's your second use for a drop shadow. Sorry, your third. So first use for a drop shadow, drop shadow. Second use, you can use it for a highlight. Third use, you can use it for a poor man's 3D repoussé kind of effect. Fourth use, you can use it for a stroke. Why would I want to use that for a stroke when I have the perfectly handy stroke option here? Remember, you might be using the stroke to do a bevel and emboss, because the bevel and emboss is being used to create a glass highlight effect. So if we just forget what these things are called and just remember them as a collection of parameters that can be done, they could do a lot of stuff with, all of a sudden you're no longer as constrained by the fact that there's only one drop shadow and only one stroke and only one bevel and emboss. Other things that we can do here, if we take the spread all the way off again, is we can turn this into a bit of a glow. Again, we've got outer glow for that. But here we can create a bit of a glow around the shape using the drop shadow. Good to know that that thing exists. Okay, let's see how that... There's a couple more parameters which I will come back to. Let's see how the drop shadow is being used in our progress bar. So in this case, the drop shadow is being used to create a little bit of a highlight. We've got this big black border that's stuck around the outside. Don't know what the contrast on your monitor is like. You may not be able to see the black border, but hopefully you can see that there's also a little bit of an edge of a highlight. Makes it feel like just a subtle additional emboss happening or deboss happening on the edges of this element. Makes it feel like it's just a little bit sunken in. To add that level of detail, we repurposed the drop shadow. First thing we did is I set it, I don't know why I'm saying we. You know, what is that? Who's we exactly? The first thing I did was I set the color to white. Second thing I did was set the blend mode from multiply to at least normal. You can use screen or normal. There's not going to be any difference. I really honestly believe this should be set to normal by default, because then you can switch black and white pretty easily. In fact, why don't you do that right now? Without changing anything else, don't change a thing. And you open up your layer, apply a drop shadow, set your blend mode to normal, and hit the make default. Nothing will change except for now if you change colors, you won't have to remember to go and change your blend mode. And then we changed the angle. Actually, the angle is pretty much the standard angle. You will notice that there's a use global light option here. The global light links a bunch of different layer effects to the same, using the same angle. So if I apply a bevel and emboss, for example, to this element to get a real nice cheesy button look, notice that if I go into the drop shadow and I keep use global light on and I move this angle around, the angle of my bevel and emboss is also being moved around. They are linked to the global light. All of those effects, bevel and emboss, drop shadow, and inner shadow, are used to simulate the way light interacts with a three-dimensional object. So, to create realism in a scene, assuming that you want to create a consistent lighting in your scene, which is, a pretty good artistic goal, it's a good idea to use the global light for all of those effects. However, if you're going to start overriding the uses of these layer effects in the way that I'm showing you, there's a good chance you're going to want to disconnect them from the global light so that each effect can be adjusted individually without worrying if you're going to accidentally change something that you may have painstakingly adjusted in a previous effect. So I tend to turn that off much of the time when I'm using specialized layer effects techniques like this one. Okay, so what we've also done is then we've just set a very small distance. So the distance of 0 means the shadow is going to be exactly the same all the way around the object, and it's going to basically ignore your angle altogether if your distance is 0. The distance of 2 acknowledges that there's going to be a little bit more shadow at the bottom and then a little bit at the top. That's going to give me a little bit more of a three-dimensional effect. Size of 8 pixels is to accommodate my outer glow size of 7 pixels. So we got 7 pixels all the way around from the center of the shape, or from the edge of the shape to the outer edge of this black element created by my outer glow. 7 pixels. Then we go 8 pixels, right? So that's 1 pixel all around. That's going to be poking out. And then a distance of 2 pixels. So down here we're going to have a 3 pixel kind of highlight, I guess, because the color is white, poking out over here, and none on this side. So if I play with this amount, by playing with the size and the distance, I could get a little bit poking up if I wanted to on the top part as well. That wouldn't really work for the deboss effect, because really the reason we're getting a highlight down here is theoretically because the light is hitting it at a certain angle, and it wouldn't be hitting this side at all. It should, if anything, be darkened, because you can't get any darker than black, so it didn't even make sense to attempt to do that. So this drop shadow here is being used for a bevel effect. Let's move up the stack. So the drop shadow here is really kind of useless. Let's turn all these other ones off. I'm going to regret this, aren't I? Without the outer glow. You can see there a bit more clearly what that drop shadow's doing. Now we're going to stick the outer glow on top. Here you can clearly see how the combination of outer glow and drop shadow does create a little bit of a deboss effect. The outer glow parameters are pretty easy to understand. Oh no, I've hit the 15-minute limit. Alright, I'll catch you guys on the flip side.